תורת הכל, מאת דוקטור אלון גלעדי. מאמר שישי. הבה נתבונן בשגיאה.
Well, E is equal to mc squared, according to the result of the last article of Einstein's Year of Wonders, the fourth article. However, this result is not accurate, even according to current conventional science. According to the currently accepted formulation, E squared is equal to mc squared squared plus pc squared. And why? Because otherwise the claim that light carries energy cannot be sustained. After all, according to current science, light is a massless photon, and if it has no mass, then according to E equal to mc squared, its energy should be zero. However, according to current science, the energy of the photon is not zero. It carries energy, and therefore it must be measured using its frequency multiplied by the speed of light. In other words, if the mass is zero, what remains is the frequency and the speed of light. Hence the formula E squared is equal to mc squared squared plus pc squared. From these things, it follows that the claim of a direct correlation between mass and energy, the claim that it is mass at rest and so on, is fundamentally wrong. Mass is not created from mere energy, and it is not created from a mere field. It is true that within mass there is enormous energy, but this does not mean, neither logically nor practically, that mass is created from pure energy per se. In any case, from this formula, it is certainly not possible to conclude that the mass contained in energy can be created from pure energy. E is a measure of what is in mass. It is not an independent entity that creates mass. Later, we will also see things in the context of fields and in the context of the serious error of modern conventional science, according to which mass is created from a field, from excitation in a field. In other words, from a field whose origin is unknown and from where it comes, matter was created. This is an error that continues the chain of errors of the two central masters of modern conventional science, a science that went from error to error to error until the moment of correction arrived. Well, just as 1905 was the year of the breakthrough of the special theory of relativity and later of the general theory of relativity, it was also, in fact, the common denominator from which the historical separation between the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics occurred. And why? Because that paper, among Einstein's 4 papers from 1905, on the basis of which he was awarded the Nobel Prize, is the paper required for the photoelectric phenomenon, that is, for the phenomenon of light operating in packets, operating in frequencies, operating in quanta, when it carries electromagnetic energy. However, Einstein saw quantumness as a unique phenomenon of light, while reality itself is for him a continuous reality subject to the laws of nature, with the same dimension of space-time, and with the same dimension of both time change and space change. In 1924, a young man submitted his doctoral thesis to the University of Paris, in which he formulated a hypothesis that is now known by his name, the de Broglie hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, not only light has wave properties, but every particle in existence, the electron, and later also other particles that were supposedly discovered. But if every particle has wave properties, then the whole of reality is not a continuous reality. Then the whole of reality passes ostensibly into other dimensions, the quantum dimension, from which a fundamental difficulty arises. This dimension, as we shall see, does not act on the whole of reality, but ostensibly only on the smallest elements of reality. And beyond a certain size, it simply ceases to act. That doctoral thesis by de Broglie is in fact the breaking point between Einstein and the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. These are the two pillars on which modern physics rests, on which modern observation of the universe rests. And these two pillars, almost all of them, are fundamentally wrong. Within the framework of that development of quantum theory and particle theory, additional particles that were previously unknown began to be discovered, supposedly. As part of the understanding of reality, it is claimed that the most fundamental particles that have been discovered are the quarks, which make up the proton and the neutron. According to the model, these quarks are in a state of sticking that cannot be separated, together with additional particles called gluons. According to this model, gluons carry the strong force, while quarks carry partial charges, 2/3, 1/3, and so on, and at the same time are also attributed a color, linking them to the strong force. Thus, a theory of particles and more particles developed each time they failed to explain observations in reality within the framework of quantum mechanics. If, for example, a normal phenomenon was observed in nature in which a free neutron decays into a proton, an electron, and something else, attempts were made to explain this using a new force called the weak force. And if there is a force, the weak nuclear force, that causes the neutron to decay into a proton and so on, then according to modular logic, there must also be a particle that carries the weak nuclear force and performs this operation. The same goes in the opposite direction, which is much rarer, a process that occurs in 1 in 10 to the 22nd power, in a certain element of xenon that transforms into another element. That is, a transition from 54 protons and electrons and 70 neutrons to 72 neutrons and 52 protons and 52 electrons. This is an extremely rare phenomenon in nature, and it too has been explained by particles that carry the weak force, the weak nuclear force. And so, within the framework of that observation of the small dimensions of the universe, more and more particles were added. The photons, W particles, Z particles, the neutrino, the Higgs particle, which according to the claim is supposed to establish mass, and so on and so forth. And when did those particles appear? Precisely at the moments when we observed reality using a certain model and saw that reality did not fit with it. Then additional particles were introduced. Where did those particles come from? That is a good question. The lion's share of them coming from nowhere. They simply appeared suddenly, and after the process in which they participated, they were as if they had not been, and all of them together neither existed nor were they created. When we look at Einstein's special and general theories of relativity and the quantum theory opposite it, it becomes clear that these are two theories that separated from the same common starting point. Light acting in packets within the framework of the photoelectric effect. They separated from each other because the theory of relativity does not operate in the framework of particles, does not operate in the small dimensions of reality. There, it collapses. On the other hand, quantum mechanics does not operate in the large framework. It stops at a certain size, a very small size, and beyond. Thus, two theories were created here. A separation was created between two theories that were supposedly the central theories for understanding the universe. These separate trends of the two masters deepened until a situation was created in which every time one of the theories encountered a phenomenon or observation that did not agree with it, new models were developed to continue and sustain it. That is, if the theory of relativity does not work in the framework of small particles, we have quantum mechanics, and if the theory of relativity does not work in the framework of the Big Bang, does not work in the face of black holes, and does not work in the face of the expansion of the universe, then new components are invented to make it work. dark matter that causes the universe not to collapse, additional constants that will allow both expansion and non-collapse, and so on and so forth. And so on in quantum mechanics. If something does not work, we say that there is uncertainty. If a phenomenon is seen that appears as both a particle and a wave, we say that it is both a particle and a wave. If we fail to measure the behavior of the small particle, we say that it is not possible to measure, that there is a probability here, that the observer is the one who determines what the outcome will be, and so on. And if there is an unexplained phenomenon in quantum reality, we invent new particles that operate in complete contradiction to the laws of nature. And all this instead of addressing the foundations of science, the foundations of scientific observation. And the basis of scientific observation is simple. If a certain theory does not work, we must check whether it is not a false theory. As Karl Popper says, every scientific theory is a refutable theory. And if it is a theory that cannot be refutable, then it is not a scientific theory. It is very simple. When there is a theory that does not fit with reality, and we repeatedly force reality so that the theory remains valid, we move from error to error to error. In the end, we find ourselves with two masters who have developed as error upon error upon error. And what does this remind us of? It reminds us of moral philosophical development. It reminds us of religious development, error after error after error. And there is a correlation between these and these. Why? Because, as mentioned, it is very convenient in modern times to remain, so to speak, with a relatively true theory. It is convenient to stay with the theory of uncertainty, with the theory of chance. This fits well with concepts of absurdity, ambiguity, the relativity of truth. Truth determined by each individual, personal truth, rather than general truth, and so on. But there is one small thing that does not fit, neither here nor here. The very theories that lead to these conclusions are fundamentally wrong theories. This is what rational science says. A theory that does not fit with reality, the theory must be tested, not to add one more element after another to make it work, but first to test whether the theory itself is true or false. First, when Lorentz sought to explain the phenomenon of light, he did so within the framework of the reality of ether. Why? Because according to his method, it was impossible to understand a wave phenomenon, and in general, the material occurrences in reality without the existence of some intermediary entity. In contrast with Einstein, the ether was removed from the picture, and in its place was the reality of space-time. This reality includes gravity, the development of waves, frequencies, fields, and other phenomena. However, here too, the same fundamental question arises. Why? If we remove the concept of space-time, a mere negation is not enough. An alternative model must be placed in its place, a model that will explain those phenomena that must occur within the framework of some physical reality that mediates between them. The general and framework explanation for this is the theory of the center. According to the theory of the center, the universe is not a balloon that inflates from a point that no longer exists, but a physical reality that began from a certain point that remains in existence at the center of the universe. Around this point, the entire universe revolves by means of the phenomena of attraction and repulsion between its parts. This results in an ordered and rotating universe, and not a universe that expands to infinity in a boundless manner. At this point, we must do what neither Einstein nor others did: ask the fundamental question, why? Why is there space-time? Not because it fits into certain formulas, which in any case do not fit with either the small or the large reality, but because we must first understand what time and what space are. When we understand what time and what space are, we can examine whether there can indeed be an entity of space-time that can be curved, folded, or moved back and forth in it. A thorough conceptual examination reveals that time and space are not independent entities in themselves. Here, for the purpose of discussion, we must set aside the question of space at the moment of the Big Bang and before it, and look at the space found within the universe after the Big Bang. Space in the universe is not an entity in itself, but a measurement of relationships between substances. Time in the universe is not an entity in itself, but a measurement of a phenomenon between cause and effect. Therefore, these two dimensions, space and time, are not independent ontological entities, but rather means of measuring phenomena in reality per se. From this follows a fundamental conclusion. In order to understand reality, space and time should not be treated as independent entities, but rather one must return to what is measured by them, to the forces, to the materials, and to the relationships between them, and from this understand the natural reality of the universe. Say from now on, we are indeed in a reality of particles, fields, and forces, but this is not a reality of an ether nor of space-time. It is a reality of a central point, of a central rotation, of a central force, and of a central field, all of them together as the physical foundations for understanding the structure of the universe. According to modern scientific convention, physical reality began with a primordial state in which a single central force existed, from which the four fundamental forces split. First, the strong nuclear force versus the electromagnetic and weak forces, and then the separation of these into the electromagnetic and weak forces, and then also into the gravitational force, or, in Einstein's formulation, the curvature of space-time. These forces, which were expressed as fields, supposedly gave rise to particles in what is known as excitation, with the primary elementary particles being quarks, gluons, electrons, and photons, and later the WZ and Higgs bosons also being charged. According to this description, within the framework of that initial explosion, those quarks and gluons united through a mechanism of inseparable gluing, and from them, protons and neutrons were created. After about 380,000 years, as the temperature dropped and the universe expanded, the light, photons, could break out, and atoms and molecules were formed, and that stage is recorded by convention through the cosmic background radiation. Deep flaws are already evident in the very foundations of this description, and as we will see later, even modern experiments do not resolve them, but rather amplify them. Firstly, the claim that in the beginning there were fields and forces, and from them particles were born, is a fundamentally wrong claim. This error stems directly from the misinterpretation of the formula E equals mc squared. The formula E equals mc squared has been interpreted as a claim that mass can be created from pure energy, meaning that matter is created from nothing. But this is not its physical meaning. Even according to conventional physics itself, the full formula is at least E squared equals m squared c to the fourth power plus p squared c squared. And this formula does not prove the creation of mass from energy, but at most describes a claim for energy stored in existing mass and its momentum. Mass stores energy, but is not created from energy. Energy is not an entity that creates matter, but a measure of what is already present in mass. According to modern convention, matter, the particles themselves, were created not from matter, but from a field. That is, in practice, matter was created from nothing. But this claim is inconsistent with the laws of physics themselves. If it is inconsistent with the laws of physics, the contradiction cannot be worked around using additional models, but a basic scientific assumption must be made. It is an error. Hence, another model is required, a model in which matter is created from something, not from nothing, but not forever, but within a being that has a beginning, structure, and direction. This is already a deeper dimension of thought, a dimension in which rational science, rational morality, and rational faith are not disconnected from each other. When we separate these dimensions, we get the situation we have here: the absence of true science, the absence of true morality, and the absence of true faith, all at once. Scientific convention presents a reality in which particles are created from fields, mass is created from energy, and matter emanates from spirit, from force. But beyond the conceptual fallacy, there is an even more serious physical problem here. If at the beginning of the universe there were enormous densities, extreme energies, and an enormous cosmic impulse, then under such conditions no structure unites. Everything falls apart. Unification occurs only when the conditions of impulse and density weaken, not at their peak. This is evident even in a simple experiment. When a rocket is launched from Earth under extreme thrust, nothing unites. Everything is subject to disintegration. Reunification occurs only after the thrust decreases, not during it. Therefore, the description of the formation of stable structures precisely in the midst of the violent thrust of the Big Bang, in the evolution of separation, union, separation, and then union does not correspond to the known laws of nature, but contradicts them. Not disintegration of fields to union of particles to disintegration, or non-binding of particles to union of particles, but rather disintegration to disintegration to disintegration, and then union, and so on, as we will see later. We will now examine one of the central pillars of quantum mechanics in its material sense, those elementary particles that, according to quantum theory, sustain the center of quantum behavior, the quarks, gluons, and electrons. According to the conventional model, quarks are three particles that make up the proton and neutron. They are attributed a mass that is significantly greater than the mass of the electron, as well as a partial electric charge, which when combined results in a total charge of +1 in the proton or 0 charge in the neutron. In addition, they are attributed a property called color, which links them to the carriers of the strong force, the gluons, inside the proton and neutron. This theory is based primarily on electromagnetic observation of protons, in which 3 foci were observed, a central focus and 2 side foci. However, this is not a direct measurement of the charge of the quarks themselves, nor a direct measurement of mass. Concepts such as color are not observable at all in electromagnetic observation, but are the product of a mathematical model only. Beyond the aforementioned electromagnetic observation, no other experimental observation has been made that verifies the existence of quarks as independent physical entities. The same 3 foci are found in similar foci in a proton, center, and 2 sides, but never in the same exact location when there is no single proton measured as a single entity, but rather these are statistical measurements of billions of protons. Nevertheless, all protons are identical to each other in mass and charge, just as each electron is identical to another electron, and each neutron is identical to another neutron in these aspects. Furthermore, no experiment has been performed that has tested the claim that the neutron is composed of 3 quarks with different charges. Based solely on electromagnetic observation in the proton, a mathematical model of 3 quarks accompanied by gluons moving at speeds close to the speed of light in both the proton and the neutron, was constructed. This model raises a fundamental physical question. How is a constant mass and stable observation obtained from such a dynamic, chaotic, and fast reality? This alleged reality is incompatible with physical logic and the laws of nature. This situation did not lead conventional physics to re-examine the foundations of the model, but rather the opposite. Particle-accelerated experiments, instead of indicating the collapse of quark theory, served as a basis for adding more and more particles. In all those experiments, whether in proton-antiproton, proton-proton, or other experiments, the observed result, whether direct or indirect, was always the appearance of electrons or positrons with a certain mass. There was never any direct decay into quarks, nor was there any observation of free quarks as a product of the decay of a proton or neutron. Faced with this observational reality, in which the decay of protons and neutrons leads to electrons, positrons, and sometimes something else, but never quarks, conventional physics did not see this as a refutation of the quark theory, claiming that they are always united with gluons. However, in fact, it is a direct refutation of the model. The reason for this is simple. There is no physical scenario in which quarks can unite and become an electron or a positron. Not in terms of gluons, which are not perceived as entities that can be separated from quarks, not in terms of the mass attributed to quarks, which is greater than the mass of the electron, etc. Therefore, quarks cannot be a source of an electron or a positron. And here, the results of all experiments on the decay of protons and neutrons do not lead exclusively to electrons, positrons, but sometimes also to something else, which was explained by adding an additional particle, the neutrino, in order to preserve the principle of conservation of energy. Hence the clear conclusion. All experiments do not strengthen the theory of quarks and gluons, but rather prove unequivocally that it is a fundamentally wrong theory. We will now turn to observing the principle of particle-wave duality, which is one of the central elements of quantum mechanics. We have already seen that the material basis of this theory is an incorrect one, and we will see this later in relation to other particles such as W, Z, and others, all of which constitute mathematical models deduced from observations in order to preserve the fundamental model of quarks and quantum mechanics, models that are in themselves incorrect. When we look at the principle of particle-wave duality and at the point of separation between Einstein and the continuous reality and the particle quantum reality, a reality of packets, of frequencies, and so on, the same fundamental error is revealed both in Einstein and in quantum mechanics. The reason for this lies in a misunderstanding of the relationship between a particle and a field. We will examine this using the basic example of the electron. It is known that the electron has a radial electric field, a static field that acts in the form of rays that emanate from the electron in all directions, are perpendicular to it, and continue to infinity. Although the energy intensity decreases with distance, it decreases asymptotically and never disappears. Therefore, the electron's field is a continuous and persistent field. When the electron is in motion, another field is added to the electric field, the magnetic field. This results in the electromagnetic field of the electron and in parallel also of the positron, but in opposite directions of the fields. Here lies the source of the confusion. The field is related to the particle in a necessary connection. There is no field without a particle, and there is no field that creates a particle. The field is a property of the particle, and it arises from it. The particle itself is not a wave, but its field behaves like a wave. Therefore, there is no contradiction between a particle and a wave. The wave is not the particle itself, but a phenomenon of the particle's field. When energy is added to the system, a phenomenon called a photon appears, which is devoid of mass. However, this is not an independent particle in the material sense, but a phenomenon that occurs on top of the particle's field. Thus, the photon that is conventionally perceived as a particle does not exist at all. Light is not a particle that is also a wave, paradoxically, but is a wave expression of a phenomenon in the particle's field. Thus, a clear unity is obtained. A particle and a field are united together. The particle is the source of the field, and the field behaves like a wave during phenomena within it. In motion, or with the addition of energy, a wave phenomenon is obtained, without attributing a wave nature to the particle itself. The things are true for both the negatively charged electron and the positively charged positron. Therefore, there is no contradiction between the reality of continuous particles and the reality of packets and frequencies. Reality is one. Matter and field are united together, and waves are an expression of the fields of matter, spirit and matter alike, without false duality and without artificial paradox.